love across the globe. Our Fox Carolina's Brooklyn Cromer tells us how 2 churches in Spartanburg are supporting Ukraine.
We're a family here in the church, and the experience of losing our loved ones impacted everyone here.
As gunfire and bombs continue raining down on Ukraine, the war hits close to home for Victoria Prokopchik and other members of Tabernacle Salvation Church in Inman.
Going through grieving, understanding how much pain the Ukrainian people are going through right now. The church here locally has had such a big impact.
We told you about Victoria and her church family starting a donation drive last year.
When you aired our story, the impact that it had was amazing. It helped us fill the first container, and now we are on the 10th container.
The church receiving enough donations from the community to fill 10 shipping containers, sending 165 tons of food, medical supplies, and personal items to Ukraine.
It just gives you goosebumps. The community here is amazing.
And in downtown Spartanburg, Minister Sue Perrin is setting up for a vigil this Friday night.
Here it is a year later, and we are still facing the same tragedy, the same violence.
Calling the community to pray for peace.
The Ukrainian community in Spartanburg is growing. Many of them do have families in Ukraine. We need to show our support for them and for their families.
In Spartanburg County, Brooklyn Cromer, Fox Carolina News.
And that prayer vigil is this Friday night from 5:30 until 6:30. That's going to be at Central United Methodist in downtown Spartanburg. And in Inman, Tabernacle of Salvation Church is collecting donations daily from 9 p.m. or from 4 to 9 p.m. And you can find out more information on our website at foxcarolina.com.